Howdy, and welcome to Wise About Texas, the Texas History Podcast. This is your host, Ken Wise, and thank you very much for tuning in today for a little bit of Texas history. Today, we're going to continue with part 2 of the interview of retired Texas Rangers Senior Captain Tony Leal. The feedback on part 1 has been fantastic, and I think you're going to like part 2 just as much. If you haven't listened to part 1, go back to the last episode released a little over a week ago and check out part 1 of the interview. And please enjoy part 2 of the interview with retired Texas Ranger Tony Leal. Okay, we touched on the history of the Rangers earlier. I want to talk a little bit more about that. How do you, in your opinion, how does the 200-year history of the Texas Rangers influence the organization today?
Well, I think that the 200 years of history influence it with a great deal of pride, admiration, and you've heard other people say this, to leave it better than you found it. There's a very strong spirit of corps within the Ranger Division. They follow a lot of tradition that doesn't go through sometimes the rest of the department, and I don't mean that in holding on to old things that need to go. I mean those in traditions where I've heard, say, a DPS narcotics agent. It's not a bad thing. It's how they do things. But I've heard them call their captain by their first name. Okay, John, thanks. That would never happen in the Ranger Division, because in the highest, now we call them majors now, okay, but a company commander is what a Ranger major is, right? Company commander. And have we talked about how they're broke up into companies?
We hadn't. Yeah, we're going to talk about that for sure.
So, but a company commander is in charge of that company. All right, it's a geographical area of the state, and so the highest rank in the day was captain for those company commanders, and then one captain would be selected as the senior captain. And if people that have been in the military will know that you can, within a division in the Marine Corps, Army, whatever, you can have several captains and have one captain that's a battalion commander, right? And they would refer to that guy as the senior captain. So he doesn't necessarily have to make major, but he's the senior captain, which is in command of those other captains. So the Rangers are very much tied to that kind of structure, right? To this day, the Rangers of old time, and I say old time, my time, that are still working and that are retired will refer to me as senior or senior captain. When the DPS title for it is chief for other divisions of that rank, or even assistant director. Now, nobody calls the Ranger chief the assistant director of DPS, an assistant director of DPS. They call him chief. Most of the newer generation does. But sometimes you'll hear, if I get a call right now from anybody, from Rangers that work for me, they'll call me senior captain. Joe Harrelson still calls me captain, because I was his captain. And that was traditionally a higher rank. So I tell people, you got to think about it like Navy versus Army. A captain in the Navy is the same rank as a colonel in the Army. If you're a captain in the Army, if you don't know the history, you would think, well, a captain in the Navy and a captain in the Army is the same rank, and they are not. A captain in the Navy is much higher, admiral being that of a general, and a captain in the Navy being that as a full colonel. And then anyway, so there's these rank structures, right? So those are the kind of traditions I'm talking about in the Rangers. That we still wear, unless you're deployed, you're still going to see the Rangers in a suit and tie. You're going to see them with their pistol where you can see it, and you're going to see them with their badge pinned to their shirt. Which is expensive because you ruin shirts, your whole career. But it's such a tradition that there's no other there's no other way to do it.
Well, let's digress a minute and talk about those companies you mentioned, because I don't think we've been through that. So the Rangers, as a division of DPS, has 100 some odd. There are 100 and
right at 160 right now.
160 Rangers around the state. They break up into companies that are lettered A through F, if I recall. And so in Houston, for example, was Company A. So when you were the captain,
Company A commander,
you were Company A commander, which includes Liberty County, where you started.
Exactly.
And so each company has a geographic region, like not unlike a Court of Appeals district, and you're the captain for that region. So
it's funny you say that, because way back in the day, the companies were more in line with the court jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. So if you would look at, the state district courts in one area, those would be the outlines of, say, Company A, and then we would work with those DAs that reported to the same district judges, right? So when I was Ranger in Seguin, we weren't aligned with anything else other than, hey, I have a DA who is over Hallettsville, Gonzales, Seguin, and Columbus. So that was my area. But that didn't correspond with anything else in the state as a line of emergency management, right?
Right.
But that's who we worked with. That's how it was set up. So, back in about 08 or 09, they split it up and said, hey, we're still going to have the 6 companies plus the headquarters company, but they're going to be the same as all the other state emergency management lines. So, in our companies matched everybody else, because we were started so early that our line stayed with the judges' lines, with the DA's lines, and they were overrun by other DPS, Highwood. Everybody else had different lines, so they changed that. But they're still the original companies, 6 of them, with a few. Like one example, when I was the captain in Houston, I did not have Brian. Or Brian would have been part of the Waco company. But when they changed the lines, Brian came under Company A and out of Company F, and that matches the emergency management lines. All right? But it's still 6 companies. Company A is in Houston, Company B in Dallas, Company C in Lubbock, Company D is Waco, used to be in San Antonio, but that's moved through the lines we're talking about. Midland moved to El Paso, and Lubbock. And then you have the headquarters company, which is Travis County and Austin headquarters. They're at Lamar.
And then you have a company now on the border dedicated.
Well, that was at Company G, which we had 7 companies for about 2 years.
Oh, and they disbanded it.
They disbanded that and said, no, we're going with the original 6, and staying that way. So you have a company commander now in D, which used to be in San Antonio, who is now down in McAllen. And Company F, because of the way the lines we're talking about, Company F's out of Waco and encompasses San Antonio.
And what that really shows is as the state has evolved, when you change a state, a society, any community, your law enforcement needs evolve with that. And one of the great things about the Rangers is they've evolved with those needs.
Yeah.
For better or worse. Sometimes it hadn't been so good, but that's an incredible asset for a state, right, to have an organization that can be so flexible and meet those needs, because their standards are so high. There's
right.
nothing you can't learn. I remember, I think this is right, that maybe the first non-FBI agent to go through the profiling training was a Texas Ranger. Mm-hmm. And so things like that are really, really important. One of the things you mentioned, the statute about the jurisdiction of the Rangers, was there's a part of that statute that says something about a district judge being able to order Rangers to serve civil process. So I used to threaten Cleet Buckaloo when he was captain of Company A that he was going to be serving subpoenas if he wasn't nice to me. But that's a lot of fun. All right, well, I want to get into some nitty-gritty of the Ranger career and see what I can pull out of you, because there's always good stories. Who were some of your mentors as a young Ranger?
I mean, early on in Fort Bend County, Jim Peters, Milton Wright, who I didn't get to work with Jim, but at the end of his career before he became sheriff, I got to work with Milton. Dan North, who was a Ranger captain years and years ago in Houston. Grady Sessoms. But my real admiration of Rangers, they were more like those people I mentioned before were people I knew of and looked up to. But my real admiration for Rangers, and when I really evolved into thinking, okay, this is something I maybe can do or I want to do, was when I got to San Antonio. And in San Antonio, I worked with Captain Jack Dean, who, people say this, it kind of sounds corny, but literally, if you went to Hollywood and said, we need an actor that looks like, walks like, talks like a Texas Ranger, it would have been Jack Dean. He was probably 6'3", our age now, 50-ish when I met him, in the shape that you'd think he was 30, gray-headed, and just looked and walked and talked like a Texas Ranger. I met Ray Martinez there. I met Al Cuellar there. Rudy Rodriguez there. Gary De Los Santos. And so, two things for me, and I don't usually get, but it was I got to know Rangers one-on-one because of my rank of sergeant. And once you make sergeant, you're working with them more than, say, a road trooper, because when they need assets from the highway patrol, that's who they're working with. So you're working more with them on their requests and that, and also because, unlike what some people like to think, I just named, I think, 5 Hispanic Rangers who were working in San Antonio when I got there. Yeah. And were very famous Rangers and had worked, for years, and working for Jack Dean, and Jack Dean was a legendary border ranger who had worked for AYLE, all these really old names of Rangers. And I had, if we have time, I'll tell you, when I made, something happened while the first year that I was a Ranger, or the first year that I was a highway patrol sergeant in San Antonio, and that is that a crazy guy took over in Waco, and there was a big siege there. So that was 1993, and so all the Rangers.
You're talking about David Koresh.
Talking about Koresh. Yeah. So all the Rangers were sent there. A lot of people don't know that. While the FBI worked the hostage negotiations, when they left it to the Rangers. The Rangers worked that crime scene. They were there for days. That's who worked that crime scene. I think you've talked about it before. Many of we've learned a lot from the FBI, but the FBI has the Rangers come teach them on a lot of stuff. Crime scene, because of the area and how we have to work crime scenes here is so different than everywhere else. But that's, yeah. But anyway, 93, all the Rangers, every one of them in every company was sent to Waco. And they left one Ranger behind at each headquarters, San Antonio being one of them, to kind of just take care of stuff. And one of the guys that stayed back against his will was Al Cuellar. He's gone now, but he was just one of the best men I've ever met, And I'm going to keep going back and forth on stuff, but
that's fine.
There was a young lady who was going to the University of Texas at San Antonio who was attacked by someone in the parking lot, raped and stabbed. And like I was talking about earlier, sometimes in the colleges or the universities, they have a lot of big police force. They may not have, detectives. And it's much more better now than it was. I'm talking about 20 years ago, 1993. So the governor, I think it was Briscoe at the time, called Jack Dean and told him, hey, he knew the parents of the daughter and it wasn't that much going on with it, and he said, need to get a Ranger over there, and so it turned into a big deal. And Al Cuellar needed help, and he went to Jack Dean. I'd been there for about a year, worked with him on manhunts and other stuff, and he asked Jack Dean. These are his words. He said he went to see Jack Dean. He said, "Hey, I need help on this case. It's too big. I got a bunch of people to watch, interview, look through records, because we had a partial license plate. They had a partial license plate." And Al Cuera says, "You think I could use that little Mexican highway patrol sergeant that's stationed across the hall? It's pretty sharp." And Jack Dean says, "Yeah, let me talk to his captain." So he goes to talk to my captain and says, "Hey, can we take Leal from your highway patrol and assign him to Al Cuera during this investigation?" I was 28 years old, and I thought it was the neatest. I mean, nothing could have happened to me at 28 years old that was, better than that. Anyway, we ended up solving this murder. We ended up arresting the guy. He had just got out on parole, and so those things, working with those guys, and that happening, led me. You asked me when I knew that I had become a ranger, and we talked about that. But knowing exactly when I decided I needed to be a ranger, that I wanted to be a ranger, that I had to be a ranger, was during that time.
And then, and Captain Dean, we just lost Captain Dean within
Yes,
the last year. He went on to be the U.S. Marshal for the Western District.
Yeah.
So he had a whole other career as a federal marshal because
and
he
I
was
think
so
there's
well
only been
respected.
two modern day people who do that. I think Captain Peoples, Jackie Peoples, it was a Conroe guy, and Jack Dean that were appointed as marshal. And to Jack's credit, he got appointed to marshal and worked under Democratic administrations and Republican administrations. They didn't remove him while he was there.
Well, as a young ranger, when you made ranger, who did you look up to?
David Maxwell, L.C. Wilson, Milton Wright. I came to Company A as a very young ranger, and those are the guys that I looked up to as my mentors. I still look up to David Maxwell as a mentor. To tell you a little, people that don't know David Maxwell, he's one of the whistleblowers right now that's, in the middle of things with what's going on in Austin. So, I mean, he's just a man of integrity, a man of high belief, and just one of the best investigators I've ever. They've done articles about him, as calling him the human lie detector, because he teaches a lot on interrogation, interviewing techniques, and things like that. But and Joe Harrelson. Joe Harrelson was a ranger here, still a ranger. So he outlived me in the division. I think he told me yesterday he's going on. He made ranger. He made ranger in 1982. So 42, 43 years now. 41. So those were. I really came into a place where there were just rangers that had come in from old school into new school. I got to work with both, and just really, I tell people I got to work with my heroes. They were just such good people.
And you eventually made Ranger Captain. And then of course, as I introduced you, you were the Senior Captain, or the Chief, as they call him now. What's the process? How do you promote within the Texas Rangers? How does that work?
So the process up into Captain, not Chief, but through Captain, is the same process we talked about before. A captain retires, all the lieutenants are eligible, and it's the exact same process again. You go take that written test, which is more elevated than the first one. And, the division's so small that all the lieutenants are going to qualify. Unless they don't have to take it, but you're qualified. So you have to have 2 years as a lieutenant to become a captain. So if you're a lieutenant, you have 2 years. Again, then it comes back to you take that written test. There's no background done per se, but there is your captain's recommendation to the chief on who should be. And then they do another interview process. And that interview process is unlike the other one, that it usually is the chief of the Rangers or assistant chief and captains that are interviewing you, because you're going to become one of them. You're going to become one of the few. There's only 6 company commanders. So you're going to become one of those 6, which is like think about the Rangers. There's only 160 out of the department. And then out of those 160, let's say there's only 30 lieutenants. And out of those 30 lieutenants, there's only 6 company commanders. So each time you go up, it becomes slimmer and slimmer and slimmer and slimmer, until you get to that top position. That's the slimmest of them all, right? So each jump like that, it's the same process. Now, when you make chief, that is, let's say a chief retires or leaves, then that is an appointment, and you're interviewed by the director of the Texas Department of Public Safety, could be the chairman of the Public Safety Commission, different times, and even to the point of meeting with the governor or talking to the governor about it before you're promoted or appointed chief.
So where did you serve as a lieutenant? You went from what was called sergeant,
yes,
then everybody was a sergeant,
right,
to lieutenant. Where did you serve then?
So I went to Austin headquarters, and I was Austin headquarters lieutenant. And then while I was there, the position of commander, which was a lieutenant's rank, commander of the cold case unit. It was a new unit that was made by the legislature, I believe in 2000. And I was a second commander. Jerry Los Santos had commanded that and then made captain. When he left, I transferred from Austin to be the commander of the cold case unit.
And then from there made captain?
And from there I made captain.
When you made captain, what company were you in charge of?
Houston. So my career as a field ranger started in Houston, and my career as a company commander was in Houston. I felt right at home. All the guys that I just listed ended up under my command. The guys that were my mentors when I came in '94, Joe Harrelson, David Maxwell, all those people, and where somebody may think, well, that's hard, or you shouldn't be able to do that. I had such respect for them, and they had such respect for me, that it was easy. It was easy to do,
And then you became the then called Senior Captain, now called Chief of the Rangers when?
I became company commander in Houston in 2005, and I was promoted to Chief of the Rangers in 2008.
2008, and I'll say it because you're too humble to say it. You were the first Hispanic chief of the Texas Rangers in Texas history.
Correct.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So and you were the youngest chief ever in the history of the DPS.
That's correct.
Which is quite an achievement. All right, well, I want to ask you kind of a historical question now. We talked about your mentors and all the great people you've worked with. What Rangers from history do you wish you had known or worked with? Having now retired as a Ranger, you understand what a Ranger is, and who are some of the characters, the Texas Rangers from history, that you wish you'd have known?
I'm not going to go with the names that maybe some, like you, I study history a lot. I think some of the guys I would want to know Major John B. Jones, who is kind of like the father of the change of the Rangers after the Civil War into more of a law enforcement group, and had done work as a law enforcement officer, in his career, and because that's a major undertaking, if you think about it. Going from, a battalion of, prior to the Civil War, it was still a lot of more Army type military force, than it was after, and then with the problems that came after the Civil War, with Reconstruction and the government being set up the way it was, and with we have one of the weakest, not the person himself, but statutory governorships in the United States. So I would like to talk to. I'm a big, I like organization, and when I say organization, I don't mean on my desk. I mean the program management and setting things up that didn't exist before. And so I would like to talk to him about, what were you looking at? What did you foresee you wanted it to look like? Being able to explain to him what it looks like now, and ask him, is this what you thought it was going to be like? And was that your vision? I would have liked to have met Manuel Gonzalez, and because he went from that almost horseback time into the newer times when you're starting labs and you're starting use radios and airplanes, and think about all those things that they saw during that time. And I got to when you say go way back, I got to know and meet Ray Martinez, still know him, and Joaquin Jackson in those. I came in at a very great time. Into the Highway Patrol, and I came into a very great time in the Rangers, because my Highway Patrol days, if you think about the date, I graduated from the DPS Academy in 1984. So our instructors, we still had instructors that had been in World War II. They were our age, and we thought they were old then, but we had instructors that were our PT instructors, and they ran it like the Marine Corps, but they were World War II vets. And the guys that I was partners with, let's say I was a 20-year-old kid in the Highway Patrol, my training partner was 35. Those guys had all, that was an era. Those guys were coming back from Vietnam. They were coming back from Korea. They were coming back, had been out of Korea. We still had those people. Some people that had fought in World War II were still on. So it was like this great generation of people that taught me respect, which is very important in the Rangers, and in DPS. It's one of those things that I think keeps it apart. And I'm not saying other departments aren't that way, but it's something that's pounded into you from the day. It's like to smilingly say yes or no, yes ma'am, no ma'am, yes sir, in the face of being cussed at, and it's like pounded into you to do it that way. We talked earlier about this portrait that I got from a guy that I sent to prison for life, and it's because if you just treat everybody with the same level of respect, and I mean up and down. Sometimes you'll have people that feel they're very important, that you treat the same as you would treat anybody else, and they feel you're disrespecting them, and you're not. It's just like, hey, once we're working a crime, I don't care if you're a billionaire, and I don't care if you're a street person, So what were we talking about, Judge?
Well, we were just talking about characters from Ranger history that you wish you had known. You mentioned John B. Jones and Lone Wolf Gonzalez, and anyone else?
Juan Seguin, I consider him a Ranger. They consider Seguin, they do, and I would like to know how that. Think about all that went on in that man's life, and how he served, and where he served, and where he ended up, and all that. How was I'm a big guy wanting to know about, like what I'm talking about with Lone Wolf Gonzalez, is how did it start? How did you get involved? Did it turn out the way you thought it would? Yeah. And I think to he may say no, didn't turn out exactly the way I wanted it to. But I don't know. I'm not a big, I admire, Frank Hammer's career and the stuff he did, but man, everybody wants to talk to him. He'd be a busy guy if everybody could talk to him that wanted to talk to him. But it was, you think about how, I'm going to go rambling, but you think about how they caught people back then. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have cell phones to follow and all that. And one of those things that goes back to the old days, say, how would you catch a robber in 1868 that was going across Texas? And I read in a book somewhere, deep in a book, and it hadn't changed. Frank Hammer followed the same way. How would you catch a bank robber in 1848 or 1868 on horseback with no telephones, none of that? You follow the water.
Yep.
They all got to water their horses in certain places, and we know where that's got to be. And same thing when Frank Hammer was chasing Bonnie and Clyde. You got to follow the gas station from this point to that point to this point and start looking. So it's not. It was much harder than we do now, but there's always been a method.
Well, I'm not so sure the method's changed all that much. You
that
still want to go where you know that criminal has to go.
Right.
Now we can do it a lot faster.
We can just do it a lot faster.
That's really interesting that you put it that way. Let's talk about a couple of cases, if you're willing to. What is sort of the hardest case you've had to work that you remember?
I mean, the hardest case I worked, and this is way before, and I worked many. And like I said, lots of murders, but it was really hard for me. And before this was a thing, we had a mass shooting in Atascosa County that involved all law enforcement. And in that firefight, 2 deputies were killed, a highway patrolman was killed, and I think 3 other officers wounded, one of them very badly. And so I was, John Martin, friend of yours, and I were the Rangers who led that investigation. It was an ambush. He set them up to ambush them. He had set up, he lived on this, you can explain it to them, people listening, but he lived down a Sendero in Atascosa County, which is roads built between mesquite, right? And so if you drove down, you could see a mile down this road, but all on both sides of you was just mesquite. And he had problems with law enforcement. He had some issues, and he set up in the mesquite next to the road. He set up gun positions with ammo packs and rifles at different, all the way down that road. And so he had been in trouble several times for domestic violence, and he would beat his wife, and the local sheriff's department put him in jail at Atascosa County. He, in his delusional mind, got tired of that, thought they were picking on him, and sets all this up one night, starts drinking, and then calls the sheriff's department and says, "I'm fixing to kill my wife." So the units start going out there. First deputy gets there. The first deputy to get there gets out of his car. He's behind him in the brush, and he ambushes him. So all but he doesn't do it until he can see them checking out. So the guy gets there just like you and I would, and say, 2181 Atascosa County on scene. So they're not going to start looking for you for a while, right? And this is very rural. So he gets out. As soon as he gets out, the guy ambushes him, kills him, takes his pistol, goes back into the brush. Now the next deputy's getting there. And as the next deputy gets there, he doesn't even know this guy's dead. He thinks he's in the trailer dealing with a domestic homicide. He checks out. Boom, same thing. The trooper comes up. This is all about 10, 15 minutes because remember, like we're talking about, it's not like Houston. This is super rural. You call for backup, they're 15, 30 minutes away. The highway patrolman comes up, and he turns in and he sees the 2 dead deputies. He starts telling them what's going on. He starts backing up, but he backs right into this guy's gunfire, and the guy runs next to the highway patrol car, that's backing up, and just popping him through the door, hits him in the leg, takes his head off. And the other officers are getting same. A border patrol agent shot. Anyway, so I had several dead people. It was a huge crime scene that John Martin and I worked. I mean, acres and acres of crime scene. And what the hardest part of that deal was for me, I'd seen many dead bodies by then. I worked Murray murders, so it wasn't that. But it was the first time I had seen a Texas highway patrolman in a Texas highway patrol uniform blown up like that. And when I walked up to the car, and and I saw him and his head across and his clipboard with his tickets and his trooper badge and all that. It's like I had worked a lot of murders, but that was seeing somebody in my family dead there. And I knew Terry. I knew this trooper. And it's in a way it's because of that, and also because it strips you of your superhero mentality, because when I was a trooper, I didn't think it happened to me. And I'd seen deputies killed, I'd seen policemen killed, but I was a state trooper, and just in my immature mind at the time, I didn't think it could happen to me. You know? And I knew Terry's wife, and I knew his kids, and I knew those deputies. And so seeing that was a tough case for me. And I'm saying I've seen lots of tough stuff. I mean, it wasn't even the most gruesome, you know, that I've seen. I've seen some terribly gruesome things. But the reality of that in that highway patrol car, you know, and that I'd spent so many years in, that looked just like my car, you know, was a change somewhere in my mind.
Well, it really brings it home.
Yeah.
And people, I don't think enough about the effect of police work on the policeman.
Yeah.
And that's very powerful. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Let's lighten it up a little bit. What were some of your favorite cases to work? Like, was there a type of case where you really liked to sink your teeth into it?
I mean, cold cases. And I really loved, I'm not as smart as you.
Oh, that's not true.
but I really enjoy, first of all, I really enjoyed making cases on nuances. Like I would always explain to cops, don't make bad law.
Good advice.
You know,
good advice for all of us in the legal system.
Don't make bad law. Half of the things that keep us from being able to properly prosecute people is of our own making. There's a reason that we have the Miranda case. There's a reason that we have all the search and seizure cases, because people did wrong things, right? So I would always tell officers, don't make bad law, but know the law so that you can work with the law, you know. And I'll give you an example. And Seguin was just that's where I matured into you asked me about the Liberty thing when I knew I was a ranger. But in Liberty County, I was a street cop ranger, right? In Seguin, I worked much closer with the district attorney there, Bud Kirkendall. Great mind. Fallis used to be a Fort Bend County prosecutor, was his chief prosecutor. I knew him from Fort Bend County, and I learned much more about becoming a professional legal police officer, you know, or not legal police officer, but knowing the nuances of the law, and, you know, search and seizure, and in confessions and interrogations, and I became a branch of that DA's office. I worked there for 10 years, you know, and I at one point the district attorney there, Bud Kirkendall, because he got tired of reviewing all of them, he had several counties. So he sent a memo to all the sheriffs within his counties, which made up whatever district that is, Columbus, Gonzales.
All the way to Comal County.
Yeah, all the way to Comal, right? He sent out a memo to all the sheriffs, says, look, anybody needing an evidentiary search warrant, which we're not going to get into here, but different than your common search.
Right.
But anybody needing an evidentiary search warrant in any of these departments, it has to be approved by Leal, by Ranger Leal. He has to help you write it, read it, or make sure everything's in the four corners of that document. Which I was very flattered at the time, but then wore my ass out because it was all these counties needing this stuff done, you know. But that's where I learned. When you asked me about my favorite cases were those where a criminal thinks they're smarter than law, thinks they're smarter than law enforcement. And I'll give you one example. I had a guy on an old murder, Mexican mafia murder, and they had a good suspect. They couldn't find him, and then we pick him up, and we knew through witnesses that we thought when they took this guy under a bridge there in Comal County, they're going to murder this other Mexican mafia associate, but they didn't get to him. Most of their murders are done from behind Their MO is almost always by your best friend, and when you get out, they got drinking and partying, and when you get out to urinate on the side of the road together, they pop you in the back of the head. I'm telling you, I've worked that murder more than one time, but it's always usually somebody, they would send you to kill me because I would trust you and let you in, and because of your allegiance to them, you would have to do it or they're going to kill you. So that's their MO. But we knew this guy had taken him out. His family said, no, he left with this guy, blah, blah, blah. But we knew that during the fight, this guy pops him, doesn't kill him. They kind of fight. He ends up killing him, but they're fighting over the gun. And one round goes into the guy's shin. Right? Now, that guy can't go to the hospital. And that guy, it's a 22 that he's using. So, but we had talked to several witnesses that said, we think, we came into our house in Seguin, this one witness, and he had been shot. We patched him up, and he left, and he's been living in Laredo, and he lived here, blah, blah, blah. So we finally picked the guy up. This is like years after the murder. I'm working on the cold case squad. And they can't put anything on him. They had the gun. And they had the gun matched to the deceased Mexican mafia member. But they couldn't tie the suspect to it. So I'm sitting there interviewing the guy, and he's in orange on an unrelated case, and I pull up his pant leg, and I just feel his shin. I can feel that bullet under there, and he looks at me, and I'll be right back. So I called DA, and the DA had been fighting with the local authorities because he didn't think they had enough. And sometimes cops think they have enough, and you got enough to indict them, but a prosecutor looks at it like, yes, you may have enough to get a warrant for probable cause, but you don't have proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's people don't, it's a high mark. It's not the same as just arresting somebody. So I called the DA's office, I tell him this is what I got, and he goes, beautiful. And I said, I said, can I get a search warrant for it? Yeah. So I get a search warrant to pull that out of the guy's leg, So I take him to the Guadalupe County Hospital. Doctors there are like, I'm not doing it. I said, what do you mean? He said, I'm not putting somebody under anesthesia because it was deep. He couldn't do local. I'm not putting somebody under anesthesia to remove that because my insurance liability won't take it. I said, well, I got a court order. And he said, I'm not going to do it. The judge wants to hold me in contempt. And everybody knew everybody there, right. So they wouldn't do it. Anyway, make a long story short, I had worked in Houston so long that I knew a doctor in Houston named Red Duke. And I explained to him, and he goes, yeah, I'll bring him on up here. And he didn't hesitate at doing it. And we x-rayed it, and ended up that we didn't have to do it because we took him in. They were going to x-ray him. They saw it, and that was enough, And even in Houston, they didn't want to, put somebody anesthesia to cross that line into that, doing surgery to get evidence, which has been done. But they had enough with the x-ray and it still being there, and the guy pled. But I always thought it was only Red Duke would have said, yeah, bring him up here.
Yeah, that's the most Texas thing ever. Red Duke working with the Texas Rangers to solve a crime as a surgeon. That's awesome. Let me ask you one more thought question before we close out. How has your philosophy, what is your philosophy of law enforcement? And how did it change through your Ranger career, if it did?
I mean, my philosophy has always been, first, I don't think, when you see a police officer get indicted, when you see a police officer doing, whether it's a bad shoot or a theft or whatever, because remember, they're a subculture of humanity, right? So it's cliche-ish, but everybody says, there's bad doctors, there's bad lawyers, bad teachers, there's bad cops, right? But when you see a police officer, very much like teachers, I think, that gets themselves in trouble, it's because they should have never been a police officer in the first place. I was never a police officer because I liked the way I looked wearing a gun. I was never a police officer because I liked the power of being able to make somebody else submit. I was not a police officer to make myself feel important, which there are cops like that. And those are the cops that end up shooting somebody they're not supposed to shoot, end up in jail for a civil rights violation, end up in jail for a sexual abuse violation, end up in jail for a corruption investigation. So the policemen that I know, that are the men and women that I know in the Rangers and DPS, Houston Police Department, and it's not, I'm not being insincere in saying, it's the people that truly want to serve and protect humanity, society, as they would their own children, from evil, from bad people. And not everybody is cut out to do that, you know? So that was my philosophy when I started. That was my philosophy throughout my career. And it remains my philosophy now. And I think that it is, you got to want to serve. You got to want to serve for, not for the paycheck, because you're not going to get one. You got to want to serve because you want to protect. And that's the difference in law enforcement service than it's the same kind of person that makes a good prosecutor, same kind of person that makes a good school teacher. It's the same kind of person that makes a good social worker, except with the nuance of, and you want to protect, and that you're willing to protect, and that you're willing to put yourself out there to say, if you're going to get to them, you're going to come through me. So that's been my philosophy. I don't have a greater philosophy that some intellectual philosophy. I just, that is who our police should be. That is who our police, and I believe the good ones are. And that's
I don't think it could be said better. That was remarkable. All right, last question before we finish.
Yes, sir.
Tell us what you're up to now in your retirement.
I'm.
What does a retired Texas Ranger do?
I went to work in the private sector. I have own with my partners a security company here in Houston. We do a lot of what's called level 4 PPO. I don't do commodity security, so I don't have the guy working for me that's sitting outside of Papacitos in a golf cart kind of security. But we do high level security. I have a lot of background in that, from executive protection from the governor's office, legislature, and other things. We work with major oil companies and many of the law firms here in Texas, throughout the state, and do investigations for them, mostly civil. I have several Rangers that work with me, and Houston PD, and some federal agents that are part of the our workforce. So we do specialized investigations for them, HR investigations, criminal investigations. And apart from that, I am very involved with the Texas Ranger Association Foundation, TRAF, and commemorating this 200th anniversary. And I don't read much fiction. I'm very much a history buff, and enjoy studying where, like I didn't know. I was reading the other day. I'm sure know this. But where did the star come from? We all know that it was made out of Cinco Peso or whatever. But there was in the state legislature in 1847, I think, they said that the official symbol, that's where we became the Lone Star State. They passed a what do you call it? Not a law, but when they do
like a resolution
or something, that the official, because this is, it had to have been before 1847 because we weren't a state yet, but that our official deal would be we're the Lone Star State, like on our flag. And so, and they wrote it says in that proclamation that any officer or government entity or representing a state will have a patch or insignia of a Lone Star on them. And so the Rangers took those coins, the Cinco Peso, which is another history lesson, and carved that star out of that as we still do today. So that's where that came from. So to answer your question, what I do today is I love my family, my kids. I got another grandkid coming, Logan.
Yep.
Is having a baby this month. God bless. And so very much work. Don't work as hard as I did when I was in the Rangers. Different kind of work. I read a lot about Texas history. I listen to a lot of podcasts like this one, which is such a great service to the state. I mean, and I'm not saying that because you learn things that you would never even think about. The history of the state. Yeah. But that's what I do. That's my history is my hobby, and then as you and I have talked, looking into the past of my family, that we have been able to on my father's side trace back literally to the late 1500s.
Well, that's a remarkable legacy of the Leal family. But much of the legacy of the Leal family going forever forward, you yourself have created. So retired Senior Captain Tony Leal, thank you so much for being our guest on Wise About Texas, the first modern-era Ranger that we've interviewed. And I really appreciate it, and thank you for your service to this state.
Thank you, Judge.
Well, that wraps it up for this episode of Wise About Texas. Thank you very much for tuning in. Find us on Instagram and X, formerly known as Twitter, at Wise About Texas. If you want to support the preservation and promotion of Texas history, go to patreon.com/wiseabouttexas. We appreciate all our supporters. And go out and do something for Texas today. And until next time, God bless Texas, and we'll see you down the road.